A trembling young woman stepped down from the dusty stagecoach in Willowbrook, Colorado territory, her worn blue dress catching the afternoon wind as she clutched two small bundles against her chest. Clara Thompson had traveled over 1,000 miles with her 6-month-old twin daughters, Lucy and Rose, carrying nothing but a battered carpetbag and letters promising a fresh start with a man she'd never met. What she discovered waiting for her would shatter every hope she'd dared to nurture. But sometimes the cruelest disappointments lead us exactly where we need to be. This is the story of a woman who forgot how to dance after tragedy struck her. Wedding day, and the gentle Marshal who taught her that trust, like music, can return to even the most wounded heart. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The late summer heat shimmered off the wooden building's lining Willowbrook's main street as Clara adjusted her grip on baby Lucy, whose fussing had grown more persistent with each mile of their journey. Rose slept peacefully in her other arm, dark lashes resting against plump cheeks that reminded Clara painfully of their father. At 23, Clara felt decades older than her years, weathered by losses that had accumulated like storm clouds. Until the simple act of breathing required conscious effort, the Colorado territory stretched endlessly in all directions, mountains rising like ancient guardians in the distance, while the town itself seemed carved from determination and desperation. In equal measure, Willowbrook consisted of perhaps 40 buildings scattered along 3 intersecting streets, each structure bearing the raw lumber appearance of recent construction. The stagecoach driver, a grizzled man named Pete, who'd shown unexpected kindness, during their journey, helped Clara retrieve her single trunk from the coach's storage compartment. "You sure someone's meeting you, miss?" Pete asked, his weathered face creased with concern as he glanced around the modest gathering of townspeople who'd come to observe the stage's arrival. "Afternoon heat's getting fierce, and those little uns need shelter." Clara nodded with more confidence than she felt, scanning the small crowd for Robert Sterling, the man whose carefully worded letters had convinced her to risk everything on this westward journey. His correspondence had painted pictures of prosperity and stability, an established business that could provide security for her and her daughters. More importantly, his letters had expressed genuine enthusiasm about welcoming a ready-made family, claiming that a man of his age appreciated the blessing of children without the uncertainties of childbirth. "Mrs. Thompson." A tall man approached, removing his hat to reveal thinning brown hair and a face that matched the daguerreotype Robert Sterling had sent months earlier. His clothing spoke of prosperity, a well-tailored vest, polished boots, and a gold watch, chain spanning his middle. But his expression, Clara noted with growing unease, bore no resemblance to the warmth she'd expected from their correspondence. "Mr. Sterling," Clara replied, attempting a smile despite the sinking sensation in her stomach. "It's wonderful to finally meet you. The journey was long, but we've arrived safely, as you can see." Robert Sterling's gaze moved from Clara's face to the twins in her arms, his expression shifting from mere coolness to something approaching dismay. Several moments passed in uncomfortable silence, while townspeople pretended not to watch the reunion with obvious curiosity. A woman in an expensive hat whispered something to her companion, both of them studying Clara with the calculating interest of people assessing a potential scandal. "You mentioned children in your letters," Sterling finally said, his voice carrying none of the warmth Clara remembered from their single meeting in Denver 6 months earlier. "But you neglected to specify their age or number." Clara blinked, in confusion, shifting Rose to a more comfortable position while Lucy began crying in earnest. I was quite specific about Lucy and Rose in my third letter, Mr. Sterling. I explained that they were born just after my husband Thomas died in the mine collapse, and that I hoped to give them a stable home with opportunities Colorado could provide. I received no such letter, Sterling replied flatly, though something in his expression suggested otherwise. My correspondence with you discussed marriage between adults, not the immediate responsibility for infants I had no part in creating. The harsh words carried clearly across the small crowd, and Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks as curious gazes became openly staring. Pete, still standing nearby with her trunk, cleared his throat disapprovingly, but said nothing. A middle-aged woman in a faded calico dress stepped closer, her face showing concern rather than mere curiosity. Perhaps we could continue this conversation somewhere more private, Clara suggested, struggling to maintain composure as both twins began crying, and her own voice threatened to crack. I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding that we can resolve. The misunderstanding, Mrs. Thompson, is your assumption that I agreed to support another man's children, Sterling replied, his voice growing colder. I advertised for a wife, to manage my household and provide companionship, not to inherit financial obligations I never accepted. The public rejection struck Clara like a physical blow, and she stumbled slightly before Pete's steadying hand found her elbow. The woman in calico moved closer, her brown eyes flashing with indignation that she directed at Sterling rather than Clara. Robert Sterling, the woman said sharply, you ought to be ashamed of yourself, treating a lady and her babies this way in front of the whole town. What would your dear mother think of such behavior? Mrs. Hayes, Sterling replied stiffly, this matter doesn't concern you. I'll arrange lodging for Mrs. Thompson at the hotel until she can make other arrangements for her return journey. Eleanor Hayes drew herself up to her full height, which barely reached Sterling's shoulder, but her presence suddenly seemed to dominate the space around them. The hotel is no place for babies, as you well know. Mrs. Thompson and her children will stay at my boarding house until she's had time to recover from this shameful treatment and decide her next steps. Clara felt tears threatening as the reality of her situation crashed over her like a Colorado avalanche. She had spent her last savings on the journey west, selling everything of value except her mother's wedding ring and a few precious mementos. Return to Pennsylvania was impossible, even if she'd wanted to face the pitying looks and whispered comments about poor choices and desperation. I appreciate your kindness, Mrs. Hayes, Clara managed, her voice barely steady, but I have very limited funds for lodging. Perhaps if Mr. Sterling and I could discuss this matter privately, we might reach some understanding. There's nothing to discuss, Sterling interrupted, his tone suggesting the conversation had already lasted longer than he'd intended. I'll pay for 3 nights at Mrs. Hayes's establishment, which should provide adequate time for you to arrange. Return transportation. Before Clara could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew everyone's attention to 2 riders heading down the main street at an easy pace. The man in front rode a magnificent bay gelding with the confident seat of someone born in the saddle, while his companion followed on a sturdy paint horse that looked better suited to ranch work than town riding. As they drew closer, Clara found herself studying the lead rider with unexpected interest. Tall and broad-shouldered, he wore a marshal's badge pinned to his dark vest and carried himself with quiet authority that seemed entirely natural rather than assumed. His face was tanned from long hours outdoors, with laugh lines around blue eyes that suggested humor despite the serious nature of his profession. When those eyes met hers across the small crowd, Clara felt an odd flutter of recognition, as though she'd been waiting for this moment without knowing it. Marshal Jake Harrison had been making his afternoon rounds when he noticed the unusual gathering around the stagecoach. In a town the size of Willowbrook, any disruption to normal routine drew attention, and the tension radiating from the group suggested this was more than casual conversation. As he dismounted and approached, Jake's experienced eye took in the scene quickly, a young woman with babies looking distressed, Robert Sterling wearing his most disagreeable expression, and Eleanor Hayes with her protective instincts clearly aroused. "Everything all right here?" Jake asked mildly, though his gaze lingered on Clara with concern he hoped wasn't too obvious. Something about her struck him immediately, perhaps the determined way she held her chin despite obvious distress, or the fierce protectiveness with which she clutched her children. Whatever it was, Jake found himself wanting to know her story, and more urgently, wanting to help resolve whatever difficulty had brought that wounded look to her green eyes. "Marshal Harrison," Sterling replied with forced cordiality. "Just a small misunderstanding about travel arrangements. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Nothing requiring official attention." Eleanor Hayes snorted indelicately. "Misunderstanding nothing. Robert Sterling brought this young lady all the way from Pennsylvania with promises of marriage, then publicly rejected her and her babies the moment she arrived. Shameful behavior that reflects poorly on our entire community." Jake's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes as he looked at Sterling with new assessment. "Is that accurate, Sterling? You arranged for Mrs. Thompson," Clara supplied quietly, grateful for the Marshal's intervention despite her embarrassment at needing rescue. "Clara Thompson. And yes, we corresponded for several months before I made this journey." "Mrs. Thompson traveled considerable distance based on your invitation?" Jake continued, his voice remaining level but carrying an undertone that made Sterling shift uncomfortably. "Correspondence between adults," Sterling replied defensively. "I made no commitments regarding children." Jake glanced at the babies in Clara's arms, both now quiet, as though sensing the tension around them. Lucy had found her thumb and sucked contentedly while studying the Marshal with wide eyes, while Rose dozed against her mother's shoulder despite the commotion. "Seems like children would be mentioned in correspondence about marriage," Jake observed, mildly. "Most women looking for husbands have some opinion about family arrangements." Clara felt compelled to defend herself despite her humiliation. "I was very clear about my circumstances, Marshal Harrison. I have copies of my letters if there's any question about what information I provided." "That won't be necessary," Jake assured her, then turned back to Sterling with an expression that had grown considerably less friendly. "What arrangements have you made for Mrs. Thompson's comfort while she considers her options?" "As I told Mrs. Hayes, I'll cover 3 nights lodging," Sterling replied, his tone suggesting he considered this generous under the circumstances. "How thoughtful," Jake replied dryly. "And after 3 nights?" Sterling's uncomfortable silence provided answer enough. Jake studied the man for a long moment, his disappointment clear without being explicitly stated. In frontier communities, a man's word and treatment of vulnerable people defined his character more surely than wealth or position ever could. "Mrs. Hayes," Jake said, turning to the boarding house owner, "I assume you have suitable accommodations for Mrs. Thompson and her daughters." "Of course," Eleanor replied immediately. "The blue room upstairs has excellent light and space for the babies, very quiet and comfortable." "Good." Jake touched his hat brim politely to Clara. "Mrs. Thompson, welcome to Willowbrook. I hope you'll find our community more hospitable than your first impression might suggest." The kindness in his voice, offered without judgment or expectation, nearly undid Clara's carefully maintained composure. She managed to nod her thanks, not trusting her voice to remain steady if she attempted speech. As the crowd began to disperse, Jake lingered while Pete loaded Clara's trunk onto Mrs. Hayes's wagon. The Marshal's presence seemed to discourage further public discussion of the awkward situation, though Clara noticed several women watching from storefronts and windows with expressions ranging from sympathy to curiosity. "Marshal," Clara said, quietly when the others had moved away, "thank you for your intervention. I realize this situation is hardly your responsibility." Jake smiled then, a warm expression that transformed his serious features into something unexpectedly gentle. "Part of keeping peace in any community involves ensuring folks are treated fairly, Mrs. Thompson. Sterling's behavior today fell short of that standard." "Nevertheless, I'm grateful for your kindness," Clara insisted. "It's been a difficult day." "I imagine so," Jake replied, his blue eyes showing understanding that went beyond mere politeness. "Traveling such distance with little ones takes considerable courage, especially under circumstances that didn't turn out as expected." Something in his tone suggested personal familiarity with disappointment and difficult circumstances, though Clara couldn't imagine what hardships a respected marshal might have faced. Before she could respond, Mrs. Hayes returned from settling her trunk in the wagon. "Ready when you are, dear," Eleanor announced cheerfully. "Those babies need feeding and rest, and I've got fresh bread cooling that should help settle your stomach after that awful scene." Clara thanked Jake once more before following Mrs. Hayes to the wagon, where young Ben Hayes waited to assist her into the seat. As they drove away from the scene of her public humiliation, Clara found herself glancing back at the Marshal, who remained standing where they'd left him, watching their departure with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. The boarding house sat on a quiet side street, lined with cottonwood trees that provided welcome shade from the afternoon heat. Mrs. Hayes's establishment was larger than Clara had expected, a two-story structure with a wraparound porch and carefully tended flower beds that spoke of pride in appearance despite the frontier setting. "Home, sweet home," Eleanor announced as Ben helped Clara down from the wagon. "Don't you worry about that Sterling nonsense for 1 minute. Some men have more money than sense, and Robert Sterling proves the point daily." Inside, the boarding house was clean and comfortable, with simple furniture and cheerful curtains that made Clara feel welcome despite her circumstances. Mrs. Hayes led her upstairs to a spacious room overlooking the flower garden, where a large bed dominated one wall and a smaller cot had been placed nearby for the babies. "Ben made the cot this morning when I heard about your arrival," Eleanor explained, bustling around the room to check that everything was properly arranged. "He's handy with carpentry, my boy is. The washstand has fresh water, and there's a chamber pot under the bed. Supper's at 6, but I can bring something up if you'd prefer privacy tonight." Clara settled Lucy and Rose on the bed, where they immediately began exploring the unfamiliar. Quilt with tiny fingers. For the first time in days, she felt safe enough to relax her constant vigilance, and exhaustion hit her like a physical weight. "You're very kind, Mrs. Hayes," Clara said, sinking into the room's single chair with relief. But I should be honest about my circumstances. Mr. Sterling mentioned paying for 3 nights, but after that, I have very little money for continued lodging." Eleanor waved dismissively. "We'll worry about payment later. Right now, you need rest, and those babies need tending. Tomorrow we can discuss longer-term arrangements." "I don't want charity," Clara said firmly, pride stiffening her spine despite her desperate circumstances. "I'm willing to work for room and board if you have any need for extra help." "Pride's a fine thing," Eleanor replied approvingly, "but accepting help when it's offered isn't charity, it's sense. And as it happens, I could use assistance with the boarding house. My previous help married a rancher last month and moved to his spread 20 miles south." Hope flickered in Clara's chest for the first time since stepping off the stagecoach. What sort of assistance? Cooking, cleaning, laundry, mending, Eleanor enumerated. nothing a capable woman couldn't handle, and the pay includes room and board for you and the babies. We can discuss specific arrangements once you've had time to settle." Clara felt tears threaten again, this time from gratitude rather than despair. "I would be honored to work for you, Mrs. Hayes. I'm experienced in all those tasks, and I promise you won't regret giving me this opportunity." "I'm sure I won't," Eleanor replied warmly. "Now, let me bring up some food and warm water for washing. Those little ones look ready for feeding and a good sleep." As Mrs. Hayes departed, Clara allowed herself to truly look around the room that might become her new home. Sunlight streamed through clean windows, highlighting the cheerful yellow curtains and the small bouquet of wildflowers someone had placed on the dresser. It wasn't the future she'd planned when she'd left Pennsylvania, but it offered something more valuable than security: dignity and the chance to support herself and her daughters through honest work. Lucy began fussing again, reminding Clara that her immediate concerns were more practical than philosophical. As she prepared to feed and change her daughters, Clara's thoughts returned to Marshal Harrison's unexpected kindness. Something about his gentle manner and understanding eyes suggested depth she'd like to explore, but she firmly pushed such thoughts away. Romance had brought her nothing but heartbreak, and her daughter's welfare had to remain her only priority. Still, as she settled Lucy at her breast while Rose dozed contentedly nearby, Clara found herself wondering about the Marshal's story. What experiences had given him such insight into disappointment and difficult circumstances? And why had his simple kindness affected her so strongly after months of emotional numbness? Outside her window, the sounds of Willowbrook's afternoon activities drifted upward. Horses clopping down the street, women calling to their children, men discussing business in voices that carried on the warm air. For the first time since Thomas's death, Clara began to imagine building a life in this place, creating a home for her daughters where they could grow up safely and proudly. The future remained uncertain, but the crushing despair that had followed. Her off the stagecoach had lifted slightly, replaced by tentative hope and determination. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Clara Thompson would face them with dignity and courage, just as she had survived every other loss life had dealt her. Tomorrow would bring new difficulties and decisions, but tonight she had shelter, kindness, and the possibility of honest work. In her current circumstances, those blessings felt like miracles, and Clara offered a silent prayer of gratitude for Eleanor Hayes's generosity and for the gentle Marshal whose intervention had prevented a bad situation from becoming truly desperate. As the sun began to set over the Colorado mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that rivaled any eastern sunset, Clara Thompson closed her eyes and allowed herself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, her journey west hadn't been a mistake after all. Dawn broke over Willowbrook with the crisp promise of autumn, golden light filtering through the lace curtains of Clara's room at Hayes boarding house. 3 weeks had passed since her arrival, and the rhythm of frontier life had begun to feel natural rather than foreign. She woke to the familiar sounds of Lucy's soft babbling and Rose's more demanding cries for attention, both twins having adapted to their new surroundings with the resilience of the very young. Clara dressed quickly, in her work dress, a practical brown cotton that had seen better days but remained presentable for her duties downstairs. The morning routine had become comfortably established. Feed and change the twins, settle them in the basket Eleanor had provided, then begin the day's work in the boarding house kitchen. The arrangement had proven beneficial for everyone involved, as Clara's skills with cooking and organization had elevated the quality of meals and service considerably. Downstairs, Eleanor was already stoking the fire in the large kitchen stove, her graying hair pinned back severely and an apron tied around her ample waist. The older woman had become something of a mother figure to Clara, offering advice and support without judgment or pity. Their working relationship had evolved into genuine friendship, built on mutual respect and shared responsibility for maintaining the boarding house's reputation. Coolwand. "Morning, Clara," Eleanor called cheerfully as Clara appeared with the twins' basket. "Sleep well. I heard Rose fussing around midnight." "She's cutting teeth," Clara replied, settling the basket in the corner where the babies could observe the kitchen activity safely. "But she settled quickly once I rubbed her gums with honey." Eleanor nodded knowingly, having raised her own children through similar trials. "Ben's already gone to collect eggs and milk. We've got 7 boarders for breakfast this morning. Plus, Marshal Harrison said he might stop by if his rounds bring him this direction." Clara felt that familiar flutter of awareness at the mention of Jake Harrison, though she tried to keep her expression neutral. The Marshal had indeed stopped by regularly over the past weeks, always with some official reason, but lingering long enough to inquire about Clara's welfare and play briefly with the twins. His attention remained scrupulously proper, never overstepping the bounds of friendship, but Clara sensed an underlying current of interest that both thrilled and terrified her. "I'll prepare extra biscuits then," Clara said practically, tying her own apron and beginning to measure flour. "Marshal Harrison appreciates good bread, and it costs little extra to ensure adequate portions." Eleanor smiled knowingly, but made no comment about Clara's particular attention to the Marshal's preferences. Instead, she began slicing bacon while Clara mixed biscuit dough with practiced efficiency. The comfortable silence between them spoke of partnership rather than mere employment, and Clara felt grateful once again for the unexpected sanctuary she'd found in this simple boarding house. The morning progressed smoothly, with boarders appearing promptly at 7 for breakfast. Clara had learned each man's preferences during her weeks of service. Mr. Peterson liked his eggs well done and his coffee black. Young Tommy Jenkins required extra helpings of everything to fuel his growing frame, and old Mr. Fletcher preferred jam with his biscuits rather than honey. Attending to these details had earned Clara respect among the boarders, who treated her with courteous appreciation rather than the dismissive attitude she'd feared. As Clara served the last plate of eggs and biscuits, the kitchen door opened to admit Marshal Harrison, removing his hat and hanging it carefully on the peg by the door. His presence immediately changed the atmosphere, not unpleasantly but noticeably, as conversations quieted slightly and postures straightened. Jake commanded, respect through competence rather than intimidation, but his authority was never in question. "Morning, Mrs. Hayes, Mrs. Thompson," Jake said politely, nodding to each woman before his gaze found the twins' basket. "Ladies," he added to Lucy and Rose, who responded with delighted squealing and enthusiastic arm-waving that made him chuckle. "Marshal," Clara replied, feeling heat rise in her cheeks as it always did when he looked at her with that particular warmth. "I'll have your breakfast ready momentarily." "No rush," Jake assured her, moving to crouch beside the twins' basket. "These two are getting bigger every day. Lucy's trying to sit up on her own now, isn't she?" Clara was touched that he'd noticed such details and could distinguish between her daughters, something even some of their boarders had yet to master. She's quite determined. Rose prefers to perfect her rolling technique before attempting more ambitious movements. "Smart girls, both of them," Jake said seriously, offering his finger to Lucy, who grasped it immediately with surprising strength. Taking time to master each skill before moving to the next shows wisdom. As Clara prepared Jake's plate, she found herself studying his interaction with her daughters. He spoke to them as though their responses mattered, listened to their babbling as though it contained important information, and showed genuine delight in their small achievements. The contrast with Robert Sterling's immediate rejection couldn't have been starker, and Clara felt her defensive walls cracking slightly despite her determination to remain emotionally guarded. "Coffee, Marshal?" Eleanor asked, though she was already pouring a cup of the strong brew Jake preferred. "Thank you kindly," Jake replied, settling at the small table Eleanor kept in the kitchen for family meals. "Any news from town I should know about?" Eleanor and Clara exchanged glances, both aware that Jake's question was partly genuine inquiry and partly excuse to linger in their company. The Marshal's official duties rarely brought him to the boarding house area during breakfast hours, but neither woman minded his presence. Clara particularly appreciated how his visit seemed to validate her position in the community, lending respectability to her situation through his obvious approval. "Victoria Sterling's been making rounds," Eleanor said carefully, settling into her own chair with a cup of coffee. "Visiting the other ladies, asking questions about Clara's situation here." Jake's expression darkened slightly, though his voice remained even. "What sort of questions?" Clara felt anxiety tighten her stomach as she placed Jake's breakfast before him. Victoria Sterling, Robert's unmarried sister, had emerged as Clara's most vocal critic in the weeks following her arrival. The woman seemed personally offended by Clara's presence in Willowbrook, though her motivations remained unclear to Clara herself. "The usual concerns about propriety," Eleanor replied diplomatically. "Whether it's appropriate for a young unmarried woman to work in a boarding house with male guests. Whether the children might be disruptive to respectable families. That sort of nonsense." "Has Miss Sterling approached you directly, Mrs. Thompson?" Jake asked, his attention focusing on Clara with an intensity that made her feel both protected and exposed. Clara hesitated, unwilling to cause trouble, but recognizing that honesty might be necessary. "She visited yesterday, while you were at the Fletcher Ranch. She suggested that my presence here reflects poorly on Mrs. Hayes's establishment and that I might consider seeking employment elsewhere." Jake's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained calm. "And your response?" "I thanked her for her concern and explained that Mrs. Hayes and I are satisfied with our arrangement," Clara replied, lifting her chin slightly. "I also mentioned that any changes to my situation would be discussed between Mrs. Hayes and myself without outside interference." Eleanor chuckled approvingly. "Said it more politely than I would have, but the message was clear enough." "Victoria Sterling left in quite a huff." Jake smiled at this, the expression warming his blue eyes in a way that made Clara's pulse quicken. "Diplomacy is often more effective than direct confrontation, though I admire your willingness to stand firm when necessary." The praise pleased Clara more than it should have, and she busied herself cleaning the kitchen to hide her reaction. Jake's good opinion had become increasingly important to her, though she tried to convince herself that his approval mattered only because of his position in the community. "Speaking of standing firm," Jake continued, addressing Eleanor, "I should mention that there's been talk at the town council about establishing standards for businesses operating within Willowbrook's limits." Both women looked up sharply at this, recognizing potential trouble in such vague language. Eleanor's boarding house operated successfully precisely because it maintained higher standards than many frontier establishments, but official scrutiny could still prove problematic. "What sort of standards?" Eleanor asked cautiously. "Nothing specific yet," Jake assured them quickly. "But Robert Sterling's been pushing for regulations about who can operate businesses and under what circumstances. Claims it's about maintaining Willowbrook's reputation as a respectable community." Clara felt her heart sink as the implications became clear. "He's targeting me specifically, isn't he?" Jake's silence provided answer enough, though his expression showed both sympathy and determination. "Sterling's still smarting from the public nature of your arrival and his handling of the situation. Some men don't take embarrassment well, especially when their behavior was questionable to begin with." "But Clara hasn't done anything wrong," Eleanor protested indignantly. "She works hard, pays her way, and causes no trouble whatsoever." Her children are well behaved and bring joy to everyone who meets them. I know that, Jake said gently. Most reasonable people in town know that. But Sterling has influence, and he's using it to make things difficult. Clara sank into the third chair at the small table, her legs suddenly unsteady. Just when she'd begun to feel secure in her new life, the familiar specter of displacement reared its head again. The twins, sensing her distress, began fussing in their basket, and Clara automatically moved to comfort them while her mind raced through limited options. "What exactly is Sterling proposing?" she asked, proud that her voice remained steady despite her inner turmoil. Jake hesitated before answering, clearly reluctant to add to her worries. Business licensing requirements that would give the council authority to approve or disapprove commercial establishments based on community standards. It's vaguely worded enough to be interpreted broadly. Eleanor's eyes flashed with anger, which means they could force me to dismiss Clara or lose my license to operate. That seems to be the general idea, Jake confirmed grimly. Though several council members have expressed reservations about such broad regulatory powers. Clara lifted Rose from the basket, holding her daughter close while her mind worked through the implications. She'd faced similar threats before, though never with children, depending on her decisions. The familiar pattern of finding stability only to have it threatened by forces beyond her control felt like a recurring nightmare. "When will the council vote on these regulations?" Clara asked, surprised by her own calm tone. 2 weeks, maybe 3, Jake replied. Sterling's still building support among the business owners. Not everyone's convinced that additional regulations are necessary. But enough might be to pass his proposal, Clara said, stating the obvious conclusion. Jake nodded reluctantly. It's possible. Eleanor stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the kitchen floor. Well, we'll see about that. I've been operating this boarding house for 15 years, and I won't be dictated to by Robert Sterling or anyone else. Clara's the best help I've ever had, and I'll not lose her because of some petty spite. Clara felt warmed by Eleanor's fierce loyalty, but also guilty about the trouble her presence was causing. "Mrs. Hayes, I don't want my situation to threaten your business. If it would be easier for everyone, I could look for other arrangements." "Absolutely not," Eleanor declared firmly. "You've done nothing wrong, and I won't reward Sterling's spite by giving him what he wants. We'll fight this properly through appropriate channels." Jake had been listening to this exchange with growing thoughtfulness, his expression suggesting ideas forming behind his careful exterior. Finally, he spoke with the measured tone Clara had learned indicated serious consideration of complex problems. "There might be another approach to this situation," he said carefully, "something that would address Sterling's stated concerns while protecting Mrs. Thompson's position here." Both women looked at him expectantly, though Clara felt a flutter of apprehension at his serious tone. Jake seemed to be weighing his words carefully, as though the wrong phrasing might cause more problems than it solved. "What sort of approach?" Eleanor asked when Jake's pause stretched longer than comfortable. Jake looked directly at Clara, his blue eyes holding an expression she couldn't quite interpret. "The regulations Sterling's proposing focus on unmarried women in commercial establishments. They couldn't apply to married women operating family businesses." Clara felt her breath catch as she grasped his meaning, though she hardly dared believe he was suggesting what his words implied. Eleanor's sharp intake of breath suggested she'd reached the same conclusion, though her expression showed surprise rather than shock. "Marshal Harrison," Clara said carefully, "are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting?" Jake's cheeks colored slightly, but his gaze remained steady. "I'm suggesting that marriage might provide protection that employment cannot. A married woman operating a family business alongside her husband would be beyond Sterling's reach." The proposal hung in the air between them, transforming the comfortable kitchen atmosphere into something charged with possibility and uncertainty. Clara's mind reeled with the implications, while her heart responded to the warmth in Jake's eyes with dangerous hope. "That's quite a practical solution," Eleanor said diplomatically, though her eyes sparkled with matchmaking satisfaction. Assuming, of course, that both parties would find such an arrangement acceptable. Clara felt heat flood her cheeks as she realized they were discussing marriage as though it were a business contract rather than a deeply personal commitment. Yet something in Jake's expression suggested his motivations extended beyond mere practical considerations, and her own reaction told her that her feelings for him had grown stronger than she'd admitted to herself. "I would need time to consider such a significant decision," Clara said carefully, unwilling to appear too eager despite the hope blooming in her chest. "Marriage is not something to be entered lightly, regardless of the circumstances prompting it." "Of course," Jake agreed immediately. "Take whatever time you need. I only wanted you to know that the option exists, should you choose to consider it." The formality of his response disappointed Clara slightly, though she recognized the wisdom of maintaining proper distance while she processed his proposal. Marriage to Jake Harrison would solve her immediate problems while potentially creating new complications of an entirely different nature. "Perhaps we should focus on breakfast cleanup," Eleanor suggested tactfully, recognizing the need to restore normal routine after such a momentous conversation. Life goes on regardless of big decisions, and routine helps clarify thinking. Clara nodded gratefully, settling Rose back in the basket before beginning to clear Jake's empty plate. The familiar motions of cleaning and organizing helped calm her racing thoughts, though she remained acutely aware of Jake's presence and the life-altering possibility he'd presented. Jake finished his coffee and rose to retrieve his hat, the movement signaling his departure, but also his understanding that Clara needed space to consider his proposal. "Thank you for breakfast, ladies. I'll check back in a day or two to see if there's any news worth knowing." The casual words carried deeper meaning that everyone present understood. Clara nodded her acknowledgement, while Eleanor murmured appropriate pleasantries about always being welcome. As Jake settled his hat and moved toward the door, Lucy began fussing for attention, her timing perfect for breaking the tension that had settled over the kitchen. "Someone wants to say goodbye," Clara observed, lifting her daughter and moving closer to Jake. "She's grown quite fond of your visits." Jake's expression softened as he looked at Lucy, who immediately reached for his badge with determined fingers. "The feeling's mutual," he said quietly, allowing the baby to explore the metal star while his eyes met Clara's with unmistakable affection. "All around." The words carried implications that made Clara's pulse quicken, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. "Goodbye, Marshal. Thank you for the information about the council proceedings." "Ma'am," Jake replied formally, touching his hat brim before departing into the morning sunshine. Clara watched through the kitchen window as Jake mounted his horse and rode toward the center of town, his straight posture and easy seat marking him as a man comfortable with authority and responsibility. The sight stirred feelings she'd thought. Buried with her first husband, emotions she'd assumed would never resurface after the devastating losses she'd endured. "Well," Eleanor said briskly, beginning to wash breakfast dishes with determined efficiency. "That was an interesting conversation." Clara returned to her own cleanup tasks, grateful for Eleanor's tactful approach to the subject. "Certainly unexpected," she agreed carefully. "Jake Harrison's a good man," Eleanor continued matter-of-factly. "Respected throughout the territory, known for his fairness and integrity. Any woman would be fortunate to earn his regard." The subtle endorsement warmed Clara, though she tried to maintain perspective about the practical nature of Jake's proposal. "He seems genuinely kind," she admitted, "and he's been wonderfully patient with Lucy and Rose. Children know quality, In adults, Eleanor observed wisely, your girls trust him completely, which speaks well of his character. Clara nodded, remembering how both twins lit up whenever Jake appeared and how naturally he interacted with them. Such ease with children couldn't be feigned, and it suggested depths to his character that she found increasingly attractive. But marriage is a serious commitment, Clara continued, voicing her concerns aloud. Even under practical circumstances, it involves promises and expectations that shouldn't be made lightly. Eleanor dried a plate with unnecessary thoroughness before responding. True enough, but sometimes practical arrangements develop into something deeper, given time and mutual respect. The hopeful note in Eleanor's voice suggested she believed Jake's feelings extended beyond mere practicality, a possibility that both thrilled and terrified Clara. Her first marriage had been built on romantic love that had made Thomas's death devastatingly painful. Could she risk such vulnerability again, even with a man as seemingly steady as Jake Harrison? The question remained unanswered as Clara finished her morning tasks and settled into the rhythm of boarding house life. Lunch preparation began immediately after breakfast cleanup, followed by laundry and room maintenance that filled the afternoon hours. The routine provided welcome distraction from the momentous decision she faced, though Jake's proposal lingered. At the edge of her consciousness, like a melody she couldn't quite forget. As the day progressed, Clara found herself observing her life in Willowbrook with new awareness. Eleanor's boarding house had become home in ways that surprised her, offering not just shelter but community and purpose. Her work here provided dignity along with survival, allowing her to support her daughters through her own efforts rather than charity. The loss of this security would devastate not just her practical situation, but her hard-won sense of independence. Yet marriage to Jake represented more than mere protection from Robert Sterling's machinations. It offered the possibility of partnership, companionship, and perhaps eventually love, with a man who had already demonstrated kindness and integrity. The risk lay in opening her heart again, making herself vulnerable to loss and disappointment, after she'd finally learned to stand alone. Evening found Clara in her room. The twins finally settled after their bedtime routine. She sat by the window overlooking Eleanor's garden, where late-blooming roses climbed a wooden trellis in defiance of the approaching autumn chill. The scene reminded her of the garden she'd tended in Pennsylvania before tragedy upended her life, and she felt a pang of longing for the simple certainties she'd once taken for granted. A soft knock at her door interrupted her reverie, and Eleanor's voice called quietly, "Clara? Might I come in?" "Of course," Clara replied, grateful for the company and the distraction from her circular thoughts. Eleanor entered carrying a tea tray, her expression kind but serious. "Thought you might like some chamomile before bed. It's been quite a day." Clara accepted the offered cup gratefully, appreciating both the gesture and Eleanor's understanding of her situation. "Thank you. I confess my thoughts have been rather unsettled since this morning's conversation." Eleanor settled into the room's second chair, her own cup cradled in capable hands. "That's understandable. Marriage proposals, even practical ones, deserve serious consideration." "Is that what you think it was?" Clara asked carefully. "A purely practical proposal?" Eleanor smiled knowingly. "Oh, my dear, if you think Jake Harrison's interest in you is purely practical, you haven't been paying attention. That man lights up like a Christmas tree whenever you enter a room." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, though Eleanor's words stirred hope rather than embarrassment. "I thought perhaps I was imagining things. He's been so careful to maintain proper boundaries." "Because he's a gentleman," Eleanor explained patiently, "and because he understands your situation well enough to know that pressuring you would, be both inappropriate and counterproductive. Clara sipped her tea thoughtfully, considering Eleanor's perspective. You've known him longer than I have. What sort of man is he, really? Eleanor's expression grew fond as she considered the question. Jake's been our Marshal for 6 years now, ever since the previous man was killed in a gunfight with cattle. Rustlers. He came here from Kansas, where he'd served as deputy in several towns, lost his first wife to cholera during an epidemic that swept through their settlement. Clara's heart clenched with sympathy as she learned of Jake's loss. I didn't know he'd been married before. She died 3 years into their marriage, before they'd had children, Eleanor continued gently. Jake doesn't speak of it often, but those who knew them said he was devoted to her. Her death changed him, made him more serious, but also more compassionate toward others facing hardship. The information cast Jake's kindness toward her in new light, suggesting understanding born of shared experience rather than mere sympathy. How long ago did she die? 8 years now, Eleanor replied. Long enough for the sharpest grief to fade, but Jake's been careful about emotional attachments since then, until recently anyway. Clara understood the implication clearly. You think his feelings for me are genuine, not just protective instincts. Towards someone in difficulty? Eleanor leaned forward earnestly. Clara, I've watched that man interact with dozens of women over the years, including several who made their interest quite plain. He's always been polite but distant, professional but uninvolved. The way he looks at you, the way he seeks excuses to visit, the way he plays with your children as though they were his own. That's not duty or sympathy. That's a man falling in love despite his best efforts to remain detached. The words stirred emotions Clara had been trying to suppress, hope and fear warring in her chest as she contemplated the possibility of love rather than mere practical arrangement. Even if that's true, there's still the question of my own feelings and whether I'm ready for such a significant commitment. Only you can answer that, Eleanor agreed, but I will say this, opportunities for genuine happiness don't come along often in this life. When they do, it's worth careful consideration before dismissing them out of fear. Clara nodded slowly, recognizing the wisdom in Eleanor's words, even as she struggled with the magnitude of the decision before her. Marriage to Jake would change everything, not just her legal status, but her entire future and that of her daughters. What if Sterling's regulations don't pass? Clara asked. What if the immediate threat to my position here disappears? Eleanor smiled gently. Then you'll have to decide whether marriage to Jake Harrison appeals to you for reasons beyond mere security, which might be the more honest question anyway. The observation struck Clara as profoundly true, and she felt some of her anxiety ease as she recognized the real nature of her dilemma. The question wasn't whether she should marry for protection, but whether she was ready to open her heart to love again, and whether Jake Harrison was the man worthy of such trust. As Eleanor departed with wishes for a peaceful night's rest, Clara remained by her window, gazing out at the star-filled Colorado sky. Her first marriage had been built on youthful passion and romantic dreams that reality had tested but never broken. This potential second marriage offered something different. Mature affection based on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine caring. The twins slept peacefully in their cot, Lucy's tiny hand curled around Rose's fingers in unconscious sisterly, a comfort. Their trust in her decisions made the weight of choice even heavier, but also clarified what mattered most. Whatever she decided about Jake's proposal, it must serve her daughter's best interests as well as her own. Tomorrow would bring new conversations, further developments in the town council situation, and perhaps greater clarity about her own feelings. Tonight, she could only sit with the question Jake had posed and listen to her heart's uncertain but increasingly hopeful response to the possibility of love reborn from the ashes of loss. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Main Street as Clara walked towards Sterling's general store, her heart pounding with nervous determination. 5 days had passed since Jake's unexpected proposal, and during that time, she had wrestled with emotions she thought buried forever. The decision forming in her mind both terrified and exhilarated her. But first, she needed to confront the source of her current troubles directly. Lucy and Rose rode contentedly in the pram Ben Hayes had constructed for them, their bright eyes taking in the bustling activity of Willowbrook's commercial district. Clara had dressed carefully for this encounter, choosing her best blue dress and pinning her hair in a style that projected confidence despite her inner turmoil. Whatever Robert Sterling's motivations for targeting her position in the community, she refused to cower in the boarding house while he spread poison about her character. The general store occupied the largest building on Main Street. It's false, front-painted in fresh white with bold lettering, advertising everything from farm implements to ladies' notions. Through the large windows, Clara could see shelves lined with goods and several customers examining merchandise, while Sterling himself supervised from behind the main counter. The sight of him stirred anger rather than intimidation, and Clara squared her shoulders before pushing through the front door. A small bell announced her entrance, and conversations quieted as heads turned to observe the young woman who had become the subject of considerable gossip. Clara nodded politely to the customers she recognized while steering the pram towards Sterling's counter with purposeful stride. She would not allow his disapproval to chase her from public spaces where she had every right to conduct business. "Mr. Sterling," Clara said clearly, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet store, "I wonder if I might speak with you about a matter of mutual concern." Sterling's expression darkened as he recognized her, and Clara noted how his gaze flickered nervously toward the other customers observing their interaction. "Mrs. Thompson, I believe I made my position regarding your situation quite clear. Upon your arrival, indeed you did," Clara replied evenly. "However, I understand you've been discussing my presence in Willowbrook with various community members, and I thought it appropriate to address your concerns directly rather than through intermediaries." The challenge was politely worded but unmistakable, and Sterling's face flushed with anger or embarrassment. Several customers had moved closer, clearly hoping to witness whatever drama might unfold between the rejected mail-order bride and the man who had spurned her so publicly. "I fail to see what concerns of mine require your input," Sterling replied stiffly. "My interest lies solely in maintaining appropriate standards for our community's businesses and residents." Clara tilted her head slightly, studying Sterling. With the same analytical attention, she might give a difficult sewing pattern. How interesting that you should phrase it that way. "Because I've heard that your proposed business regulations target unmarried women specifically, which suggests your standards aren't applied equally to all residents." A murmur rippled through the gathered customers, and Clara noticed more than one approving nod from women who had apparently chafed under similar restrictions elsewhere. Sterling's jaw tightened as he realized the conversation wasn't proceeding as he'd expected. "The regulations I've proposed address legitimate concerns about businesses operating without proper oversight," Sterling said defensively. "Gender has nothing to do with it. Yet the language specifically mentions unmarried women in commercial establishments." Clara countered smoothly. "It seems rather targeted for regulations claiming to address general oversight concerns." Before Sterling could respond, the store's door opened again to admit Victoria Sterling, Robert's sister, whose sharp features immediately hardened upon seeing Clara. Victoria had been notably absent from public interactions since Clara's arrival, but her influence behind the scenes had been unmistakable in the growing criticism of Clara's position. At the boarding house, "Brother, Victoria said crisply, barely acknowledging Clara's presence. "I see you're entertaining our local scandal." The insult hung in the air like smoke from a badly tended fire, and Clara felt anger flare in her chest. But before she could respond, another voice cut through the tension with quiet authority. "Miss Sterling, I believe you owe Mrs. Thompson an apology for that inappropriate comment." Everyone turned to see Marshal Harrison standing in the doorway, his expression calm, but his eyes holding a steely quality that made Victoria Sterling step back involuntarily. Jake moved into the store with measured steps, his presence immediately shifting the balance of power in the room. "Marshal Harrison," Victoria said with forced sweetness, "surely you agree that certain situations in our community require careful attention to maintain our reputation." "I agree completely," Jake replied, his gaze moving between the Sterling siblings with unmistakable warning, "which is why I'm concerned about behavior that reflects poorly on Willowbrook's character. Insulting hardworking women with children seems particularly damaging to our community's reputation." Clara felt warmth spread through her chest at Jake's defense, though she also recognized the complications his public support might create. The growing tension between Jake and the Sterlings could affect his position as Marshal if they succeeded in turning community opinion against him. "Mrs. Thompson," Jake continued, addressing her directly, "I wonder if I might escort you back to the boarding house. I have some information about the town council meeting that might interest you." The offer provided graceful escape from an increasingly uncomfortable situation, and Clara accepted gratefully. "Of course, Marshal. I believe I've concluded my business here anyway." As Clara maneuvered the pram toward the door, she heard Victoria Sterling whisper something sharp to her brother, though the words were too quiet to distinguish. Whatever was said caused Robert Sterling's face to darken further, and Clara suspected she hadn't heard the last of the siblings' disapproval. Outside the store, Jake fell into step beside Clara as they walked slowly toward the boarding house. The twins had dozed off during the confrontation, their peaceful faces providing sharp contrast to the adult tensions swirling around them. "That was bravely done," Jake said quietly, though perhaps not entirely wise. "The Sterlings don't take public challenges well." Clara glanced at him sideways, noting the concern in his expression. "I couldn't continue hiding at the boarding house while they spread rumors about my character. Sometimes confronting problems directly is the only way to resolve them. Or escalate them," Jake observed, though his tone carried admiration rather than criticism. "Robert Sterling looked ready to explode when you questioned his motives publicly." "Good," Clara replied, with more vehemence than she'd intended. "Perhaps if he's forced to defend his position openly, others will see the spite behind his supposed community concerns." Jake smiled at her fierce tone, the expression warming his serious features in a way that made Clara's pulse quicken. "You've got more fight in you than appearances suggest, Mrs. Thompson." "Is that a compliment or an observation, Marshal?" "Both," Jake admitted, "and maybe a warning that you're going to need that fighting spirit in the days ahead." They had reached the boarding house porch, where Eleanor Hayes sat shelling peas in the afternoon sunshine. She looked up with interest as they approached, her knowing gaze taking in Jake's presence and Clara's flushed cheeks with obvious satisfaction. "Marshal, Clara," Eleanor greeted them warmly. "How was your trip to town?" "Educational," Clara replied dryly, lifting the still sleeping Lucy from the pram while Jake carefully extracted Rose. "I've learned that direct confrontation doesn't always produce the results one hopes for." Eleanor's eyebrows rose with interest. "What sort of confrontation?" As Clara recounted her encounter with the Sterlings, Eleanor's expression grew increasingly grim. By the time Clara finished her account, the older woman was shaking her head with obvious displeasure. "Those two are poison," Eleanor declared bluntly. "Always have been, Even as children, their parents spoiled them rotten, and they've never learned to accept that the world doesn't revolve around their wishes. Jake shifted Rose to a more comfortable position, the baby's complete trust in his handling, touching Clara deeply. "The situation's getting more complicated," he admitted. "Sterling's been pressuring other business owners to support his regulations, claiming it's about protecting Willowbrook's reputation." "What kind of pressure?" Eleanor asked sharply. Jake hesitated before answering, clearly reluctant to worry. "The women unnecessarily. Financial pressure mostly, threatening to end business relationships with anyone who opposes his proposal." Clara felt her stomach clench with anxiety as the implications became clear. "He's trying to force support through economic intimidation." "Appears that way," Jake confirmed grimly. "Several shopkeepers who initially opposed the regulations have suddenly changed their positions." Eleanor's eyes flashed with anger. "That's despicable, even for Robert Sterling. Using his business position to coerce support for personal vendettas." "Oh, unfortunately, it's also effective," Jake said. "Small business owners can't afford to lose Sterling's trade, especially heading into winter when every sale matters." Clara sank into one of the porch chairs, Lucy settling contentedly in her lap, while overwhelming discouragement washed over her. Just when she'd found courage to fight for her place in Willowbrook, the obstacles seemed to multiply beyond her ability to overcome them. "There has to be something we can do," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Some way to expose Sterling's real motivations without destroying innocent people's livelihoods." Jake and Eleanor exchanged meaningful glances, clearly sharing thoughts they hadn't yet voiced. Finally, Eleanor spoke with careful deliberation. "There is one approach we haven't fully discussed," she said gently. "One that would remove you from Sterling's reach entirely while solving several problems at once." Clara looked up sharply, recognizing the direction Eleanor's thoughts were heading. "You mean Marshal Harrison's proposal?" "It deserves serious consideration," Eleanor continued earnestly. "Not just as protection from Sterling's spite, but as a genuine opportunity for happiness." Jake's expression grew carefully neutral, though Clara noticed his hands tighten slightly around Rose's small form. "The decision is entirely yours, Mrs. Thompson. I wouldn't want you to feel pressured by circumstances into a choice you might later regret." The formal tone of his response stung Clara slightly, suggesting he was withdrawing the emotional warmth she'd begun to treasure. Perhaps he was having second thoughts about his proposal, recognizing the complications her situation might bring to his own position in the community. "Marshal," Clara said carefully, "might I ask whether your offer remains open despite these recent developments?" Jake's blue eyes met hers with surprising intensity. "My offer remains unchanged regardless of any developments, Mrs. Thompson. My feelings on the matter aren't subject to community pressure or political considerations." The quiet conviction in his voice stirred something deep in Clara's chest, and she felt the last of her emotional defenses begin to crumble. Here was a man offering not just protection, but partnership. Not just security, but affection, freely given without conditions or expectations, beyond mutual respect. "In that case," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I believe I have an answer for you." Eleanor rose abruptly from her chair, gathering her basket of peas with unnecessary vigor. "I believe I hear something burning in the kitchen," she announced unconvincingly. "I'd better check on dinner preparations." As Eleanor disappeared into the house with obvious tact, Clara and Jake found themselves alone on the porch with the twins, who continued sleeping peacefully despite the momentous conversation developing around them. The late afternoon air carried the scent of approaching autumn, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled the hour with solemn resonance. "What answer is that, Mrs. Thompson?" Jake asked quietly, his formal address belied by the hope flickering in his expression. Clara took a deep breath, gathering courage for words that would change everything. "Yes, Marshal Harrison, I accept your proposal, if you're certain it's what you truly want." Jake's careful composure cracked slightly, revealing genuine joy beneath his professional reserve. "I'm certain," he said firmly. "More certain than I've been about anything in years. Even knowing the trouble my presence here has caused," Clara pressed, needing complete honesty between them. "Even understanding that marriage to me might create problems for your position as Marshal?" Jake smiled then, the expression transforming his serious features into something wonderfully warm and appealing. "Clara, may I call you Clara? The only trouble your presence has caused me is making me realize how empty my life had become. As for my position as Marshal, I serve this community to protect people like you from people like Sterling. If doing my job properly creates problems, then the problems lie with others, not with us." The use of her given name sent warmth flooding through Clara's chest, and she felt tears threaten at the unexpected tenderness in his voice. "In that case, Jake, I believe we should discuss the practical arrangements for such a significant step." Jake's smile widened at her use of his name, and he carefully transferred Rose to Clara's free arm before settling into the chair Eleanor had vacated. "What sort of arrangements concern you most?" Clara appreciated his straightforward approach to planning, recognizing it as evidence of his practical nature and genuine commitment to making their marriage successful. "Living arrangements, primarily. The twins require considerable space and attention, and I wouldn't want to impose on your bachelor household without proper preparation." "My house has 4 bedrooms, Jake said matter-of-factly. "The previous owner built it for a large family, though I've been rattling around in it alone for years. There's a nursery that's been unused since I bought the place, and plenty of room for whatever furniture or belongings you'd like to bring." The casual mention of an existing nursery stirred memories of similar conversations during her first marriage, when she and Thomas had planned excitedly for children they'd never lived to raise together. This time felt different, though, more grounded in reality and practical considerations rather than romantic dreams. "What about our working arrangement with Mrs. Hayes?" Clara asked. "I can't abandon her without adequate notice to find replacement help." Jake nodded approvingly at her consideration for Eleanor's situation. "We could maintain the arrangement temporarily if Mrs. Hayes agrees. Many married women work outside their homes when circumstances require it, and the additional income would be helpful as we establish our household." Clara felt relief that Jake didn't expect her to abandon work that had given her both purpose and independence. "And the twins? I know you've been kind to them, but raising children is a considerable responsibility." Jake's expression grew serious as he considered his response. "Clara, those little girls have brought more joy into my life these past weeks than I've felt in years. The thought of helping raise them, of being part of their daily lives and watching them grow isn't a burden to me. It's a privilege I hardly dare hope I deserve." The sincerity in his voice finally broke through Clara's remaining defenses, and she felt tears spill over as the emotional walls she'd built around her heart finally crumbled completely. "Jake," she whispered, "I'm frightened." "Of what?" he asked gently, reaching across the space between their chairs to take her free hand in his warm grasp. "Of hoping again," Clara admitted, "of believing in happiness after loss, of trusting my heart to someone new when losing Thomas nearly destroyed me." Jake's fingers tightened around hers, and his blue eyes held understanding born of similar experience. "I know that fear intimately," he said quietly. "After Mary died, I convinced myself that caring deeply was too dangerous, that the potential for loss made love too costly to risk." Clara looked up at him through her tears, recognizing shared pain that created understanding between them. "What? Changed your mind?" Jake smiled softly, his free hand reaching out to stroke Lucy's downy hair with infinite gentleness. "You did. You and these beautiful daughters of yours. You showed me that the heart's capacity for love isn't diminished by loss, and that choosing to remain closed off from connection isn't protection. It's just another kind of death." The words unlocked something deep in Clara's chest, and she felt hope bloom alongside her fear, like wildflowers pushing through winter soil. "I think I could learn to trust again," she said tentatively. "With you, I think I could be brave enough to try." "We'll learn together," Jake promised. "Whatever challenges we face, whatever difficulties arise, we'll meet them as partners. You'll never have to stand alone against the world again." As if summoned by the emotional intensity of their conversation, both twins began stirring in Clara's arms, their internal clocks indicating feeding time with reliable precision. The practical demands of motherhood intruded on the romantic moment, but Jake's immediate attention to the baby's needs, rather than irritation at the interruption, told Clara everything she needed to know about his genuine commitment to family life. "I should feed them," Clara said apologetically, already beginning to rise from her chair. "Of course," Jake agreed, standing as well. "Might I help you carry them upstairs?" The simple offer, so naturally made, represented everything Clara had missed during her months of solitary struggle. Partnership in daily tasks, shared responsibility for the twins' care, companionship in the mundane moments that made up real life rather than romantic fantasy. As they climbed the boarding house stairs together, Clara felt the last pieces of her decision fall into place. Marriage to Jake Harrison offered more than escape from Sterling's persecution or security for her daughters. It offered the possibility of love rebuilt on stronger foundations, of family created through choice rather than obligation, of happiness earned through mutual respect and shared commitment. Eleanor appeared in the hallway as they reached the landing, her expression carefully neutral despite the obvious curiosity in her eyes. "Everything settled?" she asked diplomatically. "Yes," Clara replied, her voice stronger than it had been in months. "Marshal Harrison and I are engaged to be married." Eleanor's face broke into a delighted smile that made her look years younger. "Wonderful news! When will the ceremony take place?" Clara looked at Jake questioningly, realizing they hadn't discussed timing in their focus on emotional considerations. "As soon as possible," Jake said firmly. "I see no reason to delay once." Clara's comfortable with the arrangements. "Next week, then?" Clara suggested, surprising herself with her eagerness. "That would give us time to make necessary preparations while addressing the town council situation before it becomes more problematic." "Perfect," Jake agreed. "I'll speak with Reverend Morrison tomorrow about scheduling the ceremony." As Jake departed with promises to call again the following day, Clara settled in her room to feed the twins while her mind raced with wedding preparations and the enormous changes about to transform her life. Through her window, she could see Jake mounting his horse in the fading daylight, his confident posture and gentle handling of the animal reinforcing her conviction that she was making the right choice. Lucy latched eagerly onto her breast while Rose waited patiently for her turn, both babies oblivious to the momentous decisions being made on their behalf. Clara gazed down at their peaceful faces and felt profound gratitude for the unexpected journey that had brought them to this place of safety and hope. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as word of their engagement spread through Willowbrook, and she had no illusions that Robert Sterling would accept this development gracefully. But tonight, she could hold her daughters close and dream of the future they would build together as a family, protected by love and commitment rather than mere circumstance. The sound of Eleanor's cheerful humming drifted up from the kitchen below, and Clara smiled at the older woman's obvious satisfaction. With romantic developments, she had clearly been encouraging from the beginning. Perhaps Eleanor had recognized what Clara herself had been too frightened to acknowledge, that some second chances were worth the risk of renewed heartbreak, and that love could indeed bloom again in the most unexpected gardens. As darkness settled, over Willowbrook and the twins drifted off to sleep after their evening meal, Clara allowed herself to imagine dancing again for the first time since her wedding day tragedy. The thought no longer brought only pain, but anticipation of moving to music with a partner who would protect rather than harm, who would lead with strength tempered by gentleness. Jake Harrison had offered her more than marriage and security. He had offered her the chance to heal completely, to trust again, and to rediscover joy in simple pleasures she had thought forever lost. Tomorrow, she would begin the process of becoming his wife, but tonight she was simply a woman who had remembered how to hope. The morning of Clara's wedding dawned with crystalline clarity, autumn air carrying the promise of winter, while golden sunlight painted the Colorado mountains in shades of amber and rose. She stood before the small mirror in her boarding house room, adjusting the delicate pearl buttons on her mother's ivory silk gown, carefully altered to accommodate the changes motherhood had brought to her figure. The dress had been packed away. For 2 years, unworn since her first wedding day ended in tragedy, but today it would witness new beginnings rather than haunting memories. Eleanor bustled about the room, making final adjustments to Clara's hair while keeping one eye on the twins, who sat in their shared basket wearing matching christening gowns that had belonged to Eleanor's own children decades earlier. Lucy babbled contentedly while examining her tiny hands, while Rose observed the unusual morning activity with solemn attention that suggested she understood something significant was occurring. "You look radiant, dear," Eleanor said warmly, securing the final pin in Clara's elaborate chignon, like a woman who's found her proper place in the world. Clara studied her reflection with wonder, hardly recognizing the serene bride gazing back at her. Gone was the desperate widow who had stepped off the stagecoach 6 weeks earlier, replaced by a woman who had discovered strength she never knew she possessed and love she never expected to find again. "I feel different," Clara admitted softly, "not just because of the wedding, but because of everything that's led to this moment." The woman who married Thomas was barely more than a girl, full of romantic dreams, but no real understanding of what partnership meant. Today feels like becoming someone entirely new. Eleanor's eyes misted with maternal pride as she surveyed her handiwork. "You've grown into yourself, that's what's happened. Adversity has a way of revealing character, and yours has proven admirable indeed." A gentle knock at the door interrupted their conversation, followed by Ben Hayes' voice announcing, "Marshal Harrison's here with the carriage, Mrs. Thompson. Says whenever you're ready." Clara's pulse quickened at the mention of Jake's presence. Downstairs, they had seen little of each other during the week of wedding preparations, partly due to propriety and partly because Jake had been dealing with increasing pressure from Robert Sterling and his supporters regarding the upcoming town council vote. The business regulations proposal had gained momentum despite Jake's quiet opposition, and several previously neutral council members had been swayed by Sterling's economic threats. "Tell the Marshal we'll be down momentarily," Eleanor called back, then turned to Clara with sudden seriousness. "Are you certain about this decision, dear? Once those vows are spoken, there's no turning back." Clara considered the question one final time, searching her heart for any remaining doubts or fears. What she found instead was deep certainty and anticipation that surprised her with their intensity. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life," she replied honestly. "Jake has shown me what true partnership looks like, and I want to build a life with him based on mutual respect and growing affection." Eleanor smiled with satisfaction before gathering Lucy from the basket while Clara lifted Rose. "Then let's not keep your groom waiting any longer." Downstairs, Jake stood in the boarding house parlor, wearing his finest black suit, a small bouquet of late-blooming wildflowers in his hands, and an expression of nervous anticipation that made Clara's heart flutter. When he looked up and saw her descending the stairs, his face transformed with such obvious joy and admiration that Clara felt beautiful for the first time since before Thomas's death. "Clara," Jake breathed, his voice carrying reverence that made her name sound like a prayer. "You're absolutely stunning." Heat rose in Clara's cheeks at the heartfelt compliment, and she felt suddenly shy despite their weeks of growing intimacy. "Thank you," she said simply, accepting the wildflower bouquet with hands that trembled slightly. "You look quite handsome yourself." Jake's smile broadened as he carefully took Rose from Clara's arms, the baby immediately grasping his tie with determined fingers. "Are you ready for this, Mrs. Thompson? Last chance to reconsider marrying a simple frontier marshal." There's nothing simple about you, Jake Harrison," Clara replied with growing confidence, "and I've never been more ready for anything in my life." The carriage ride to Willowbrook's small church passed in comfortable silence, both Jake and Clara lost in contemplation of the momentous step they were about to take. The twins dozed against their respective guardians, lulled by the gentle motion and seeming to sense the peaceful contentment surrounding them. As they approached the church, Clara was surprised to see a considerable gathering of townspeople assembled outside the building. Word of their hasty wedding had spread quickly through Willowbrook's close-knit community, and it appeared most residents had chosen to witness the ceremony that would resolve the ongoing controversy about Clara's place in their midst. "Quite a crowd," Jake observed mildly, though Clara noticed his hand tighten slightly on the reins. "Are you prepared for public scrutiny?" Clara surveyed the assembled faces, noting expressions ranging from warm approval to obvious curiosity, with a few showing the disapproval she had expected from Sterling's supporters. "Let them look," she said with calm dignity. "We have nothing to hide and no reason for shame." Among the crowd, Clara spotted several women who had become friends. During her weeks at the boarding house, Mrs. Patterson, whose children Clara had nursed through fever, young Mrs. Collins, whom Clara had helped with difficult pregnancy symptoms, and Martha Wells, the midwife who had expressed grudging respect for Clara's quick thinking during a complicated birth. Their presence provided moral support that strengthened Clara's resolve to face whatever challenges might arise. Conspicuously absent were Robert and Victoria Sterling, whose disapproval was evident in their refusal to acknowledge the ceremony publicly. Clara felt relief rather than disappointment at their absence, recognizing that their presence would have created tension inappropriate for such a joyful occasion. Jake helped Clara down from the carriage with careful attention to her silk skirts, then offered his arm as they walked toward the church entrance. Eleanor followed with the twins, both babies now wide awake and taking in the unusual gathering with bright-eyed interest. Inside the small church, Reverend Morrison waited at the altar wearing his finest vestments and an expression of genuine pleasure. The elderly minister had known Jake for years and had expressed wholehearted approval of his choice to remarry, particularly to a woman who had demonstrated such admirable character under difficult circumstances. The simple wooden pews filled quickly as the townspeople filed in behind them, creating an atmosphere of community celebration rather than mere legal formality. Clara felt grateful for their presence, recognizing that public support for her marriage to Jake would help establish her permanent place in Willowbrook society. As they took their positions before the altar, Jake reached for Clara's free hand, his fingers warm and steady around hers. The contact sent reassurance flowing through her, reminding her that whatever the future held, she would no longer face it alone. Dearly beloved, Reverend Morrison began in his resonant voice, we are gathered here today to witness the union of Jacob Harrison and Clara Thompson in holy matrimony. The familiar words washed over Clara like a benediction, but this time they carried deeper meaning born of genuine understanding between the partners making these vows. When the moment came to exchange promises, Clara looked directly into Jake's blue eyes and spoke from her heart. I take you, Jacob, as my husband, to stand beside you in times of joy and sorrow, to share in your dreams and support you through challenges, to build a family with you based on love, respect, and faithful partnership. Jake's voice was steady, but filled with emotion as he responded, I take you, Clara, as my wife, to protect and cherish you and your daughters, to honor your strength and independence while offering my own in return, to create with you a home where love grows stronger with each passing day. When Reverend Morrison pronounced them husband and wife, Jake's kiss was gentle but thorough, sealing their commitment before God and community with tenderness that promised deeper intimacy too. Come. The congregation erupted in applause and well wishes, the sound filling the small church with warmth and approval. As they turned to face their neighbors as a married couple, Clara felt profound gratitude for the unexpected journey that had brought her to this moment. The desperate woman who had arrived in Willowbrook seeking only survival had found instead a partnership that offered growth, healing, and the promise of genuine happiness. The celebration continued at the boarding house, where Eleanor had prepared a feast that seemed impossible given their limited planning time. Tables laden with roasted chicken, fresh bread, autumn vegetables, and Eleanor's famous apple pie filled the dining room and spilled onto the front porch. Neighbors had contributed dishes and helping hands, creating a community celebration that established Jake and Clara's marriage as a joyous occasion rather than mere practical arrangement. As evening approached and the last guests departed with congratulations and invitations to future gatherings, Clara found herself alone with Jake for the first time as his wife. They sat on the boarding house porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in brilliant colors, while the twins slept peacefully in their shared basket. Any regrets? Jake asked quietly, his arm around Clara's shoulders in a gesture that felt both new and perfectly natural. Clara leaned into his warmth, marveling at how right it felt to have his strength supporting her. None whatsoever, she replied honestly, though I confess to some nervousness about what comes next. Jake's chuckle rumbled through his chest, where Clara's head rested against his shoulder. Moving into my house, you mean? Or being married to a man you've known for such a short time? Both, Clara admitted. Everything, really. I keep expecting to wake up and discover this has all been an elaborate dream. It's real, Jake assured her, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head. And we'll figure out the practical details. Together, one day at a time. There's no rush to have everything perfect immediately. Clara appreciated his patience and understanding, recognizing once again how different this marriage was from her first. Thomas had been loving but impulsive, sweeping her into romance without considering practical realities. Jake offered steady partnership alongside growing affection, building their relationship on solid foundations rather than shifting emotions. What about the town council situation? Clara asked, voicing the concern that had lurked beneath their wedding day joy. Sterling won't abandon his campaign just because we're married now. Jake's expression grew more serious as he considered the ongoing political challenges. Actually, our marriage has complicated his position considerably. The regulations he's proposing specifically target unmarried women, so they no longer apply to you directly. He'll have to find different grounds for opposition, which may prove more difficult. But he'll try, Clara said with certainty. Men like Robert Sterling don't accept defeat gracefully. Probably, Jake agreed, but he'll have to be more careful now. Attacking a marshal's wife requires different tactics than intimidating a vulnerable widow, and Sterling's not entirely foolish despite his spite. Clara felt comfort in Jake's protective presence, but also determination to contribute to their mutual defense against future attacks. "I won't hide behind your position, Jake. If Sterling wants to challenge my right to live and work in this community, he'll find I'm not as easily intimidated as he might assume." Jake smiled at her fierce tone, the expression mixing admiration with slight concern. "I love your fighting spirit, Clara, but promise me you won't take unnecessary risks. You have more to protect now than just your own welfare." The reminder of her increased responsibilities as a wife and mother struck Clara powerfully, and she felt the weight of commitment settle around her like a comfortable shawl. "I promise to be careful," she said solemnly, "but I also won't be silenced by threats or intimidation." As full darkness settled over Willowbrook and Eleanor emerged to collect the sleeping twins for their final night in the boarding house nursery, Clara and Jake prepared for their new life together. Tomorrow would bring the practical challenges of combining households, establishing routines, and navigating their roles as husband and wife. But tonight, they could simply enjoy the peaceful satisfaction of promises kept and new beginnings embraced. The move to Jake's house proceeded smoothly over the following days, with willing neighbors helping transport Clara's few belongings and the twins' necessities to their new home. Jake's house proved even more spacious and well-appointed than Clara had remembered from her initial tour, with large windows that filled every room with natural light and careful craftsmanship, evident in details like built-in bookcases and polished hardwood floors. The nursery that Jake had mentioned proved perfect for the twins, with southern exposure that kept it warm and cheerful even as autumn weather grew crisp. Clara arranged Lucy and Rose's belongings alongside toys and furniture that had belonged to Jake's first wife's family, creating a blend of old and new that symbolized their blended family's foundations. More challenging was learning to navigate the intimacy of marriage with a man she was still coming to know. Jake proved considerate and patient, giving Clara space to adjust to sharing living quarters, while making it clear that her comfort and happiness were his primary concerns. Their conversations grew deeper and more personal, as domestic routine eliminated the formal barriers that had characterized their courtship, and Clara began to glimpse the man behind the Marshal's professional reserve. 3 weeks into their marriage, the town council finally convened to vote on Robert Sterling's proposed business regulations. Clara insisted on attending, despite Jake's preference that she avoid potential unpleasantness, arguing that her presence would demonstrate confidence in their marriage and her place in the community. The town hall was packed beyond capacity, with residents lining the walls and spilling out onto the front steps. Sterling's proposal had divided Willowbrook along economic and social lines, creating tensions that extended far beyond Clara's specific situation. Business owners who depended on Sterling's trade sat uncomfortably near neighbors who supported Clara's right to work and live freely in their community. When Mayor Wilson called for discussion of the business regulation proposal, Sterling rose immediately to address the assembly. His presentation was polished and seemingly reasonable, focusing on community standards and proper oversight without mentioning Clara specifically. But the underlying target of his proposals remained obvious to everyone present. "Willowbrook has grown rapidly in recent years," Sterling declared in his most authoritative tone. "With growth comes the need for proper regulations ensuring that businesses operating within our community meet appropriate standards of conduct and management." Several business owners nodded agreement, though Clara noticed their expressions remained troubled despite their apparent support. Sterling's economic pressure campaign had clearly been effective in securing public backing from people who privately disagreed with his motivations. When Sterling finished his presentation, Mayor Wilson opened the floor for community input. To Clara's surprise, Martha Wells rose immediately, her weathered face determined despite obvious nervousness about public speaking. "I've been delivering babies in this territory for 20 years, Martha announced in her clear, carrying voice. "In that time, I've seen plenty of women struggle alone with children and responsibilities that would break most men. Mrs. Harrison has shown more courage and capability than any woman I've met, and trying to drive her out of our community because of spite and jealousy is shameful." Applause erupted from several sections of the assembly, clearly indicating that Clara had more support than Sterling's vocal opposition suggested. Other women rose to speak, sharing stories of Clara's kindness and competence during their weeks at the boarding house, and her helpfulness during difficult times. When the testimonials concluded, Jake rose with the quiet authority that commanded immediate attention throughout the room. "As Marshal, I've had occasion to observe Mrs. Harrison's character under various circumstances," he said formally. "She has demonstrated integrity, compassion, and strength that would benefit any community fortunate enough to claim her as a resident." The public endorsement from Willowbrook's most respected law enforcement officer carried considerable weight, and Clara felt tears threaten at Jake's willingness to use his position to defend her publicly. Sterling's face darkened with anger, but he remained seated as other speakers offered support for Clara's position. When the vote was finally called, Sterling's proposal failed by a margin of 4-1, with only Sterling himself and banker Charles Morrison supporting the regulations. The decisive defeat effectively ended Sterling's campaign against Clara's presence in Willowbrook, though Clara suspected his resentment would continue to simmer beneath the surface. As the crowd dispersed with congratulations and relieved conversations, Clara felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't fully realized she'd been carrying. The public vindication of her place in the community meant more than mere victory over Sterling's spite. It represented acceptance and belonging that she had craved since her arrival. "Satisfied?" Jake asked quietly as they walked home together through the crisp autumn evening. "Relieved," Clara replied honestly, "though I suspect Robert Sterling won't forget this defeat easily." "Probably not," Jake agreed, "but he'll have to find other targets for his spite. You've established yourself too firmly here for him to dislodge easily." That evening, as Clara settled the twins for their bedtime routine in their comfortable nursery, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her family to this place of safety and acceptance. The desperate widow who had stepped off the stagecoach had been transformed through love and determination into a wife, mother, and valued community member. Later, as she sat beside Jake in their comfortable parlor while he read the territorial newspaper and she mended small tears in the twins' clothing, Clara felt profound contentment settle over her like a warm blanket. This quiet domestic scene represented everything she had hoped for but never dared expect: partnership, security, and the promise of love growing stronger with each shared day. "Jake," she said softly, setting aside her mending to study his profile in the lamplight, "do you ever think about dancing?" Jake looked up from his newspaper with surprise, clearly not expecting such a question. "Dancing? Not particularly. Why, do you ask?" Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks as she prepared to share something she had never told anyone, not even Eleanor. "My first wedding ended before the dancing began. There was an accident during the ceremony, and I never had the chance to dance with Thomas as his wife. For years, the thought of dancing brought only painful memories." Jake set aside his newspaper entirely, giving Clara his complete attention as he recognized the significance of her confession. "And now? Now I think I might like to try again," Clara said with growing confidence. "With you, I think I could remember why dancing used to bring me joy." Jake's expressions softened with understanding and tenderness that made Clara's heart flutter with anticipation. "The church is planning a harvest celebration next month," he said carefully. "There will be music and dancing. Would you like to attend together?" Doom. Clara considered the prospect of stepping onto a dance floor for the first time in years, moving to music in Jake's arms while their community watched approvingly. The thought no longer brought fear, but excitement about reclaiming another piece of the joy she had thought permanently lost. "Yes," she said firmly, "I would like that very much." Jake smiled with delight that matched her own growing anticipation. "Then we'll dance, Mrs. Harrison, and if anyone objects to our celebration, they'll answer to me." The promise in his voice stirred feelings in Clara that went far beyond gratitude or affection. Here was a man who would protect her right to happiness, as fiercely as he defended her safety, who understood that healing sometimes required the courage to embrace joy after sorrow. As autumn deepened into winter and Clara's marriage to Jake settled into comfortable routine, she began to truly understand what partnership meant. They shared household decisions, childcare responsibilities, and plans for the future with an equality that surprised Clara with its naturalness. Jake's respect for her opinions and his obvious delight in the twins' development created a family atmosphere that felt both stable and joyful. The harvest celebration arrived with crisp November air and the first threat of winter snow. The church hall had been decorated with autumn leaves and late-blooming flowers, while Mrs. Patterson's husband provided music on his fiddle for couples eager to celebrate the successful growing season. Clara had spent considerable time choosing her dress for the occasion, finally selecting a deep blue silk that complemented her eyes and made her feel both elegant and confident. Jake wore his finest suit with obvious pride in his wife's appearance, and together they made a striking couple as they entered the hall hand in hand. When the first waltz began, Jake led Clara onto the dance floor with gentle confidence, his hand warm and steady at her waist, while his eyes held hers with unmistakable love. As they moved together to the music, Clara felt the last shadows of her tragic first wedding finally fade away, replaced by joy in the present moment and hope for their shared future. "No regrets?" Jake asked quietly as they turned together. In perfect harmony, Clara smiled up at him with complete happiness, her fears about dancing finally put to rest by the safety of his embrace and the music of new beginnings. Only that it took us so long to find each other. As they danced beneath the warm glow of lantern light, surrounded by their neighbors' approving smiles and their daughters' contented babbling from Eleanor's arms nearby, Clara knew she had finally found her true home. Not just in Willowbrook or Jake's house, but in the love they were building together, one shared moment at a time. The mail-order bride who had arrived seeking desperate security had discovered instead that the heart's capacity for healing and love could exceed all expectations. In Jake's arms, moving to music that spoke of celebration rather than sorrow, Clara Thompson Harrison finally understood that some journeys end exactly where they were meant to begin. Spring arrived in Willowbrook with unexpected gentleness, melting the harsh winter snow into streams that carved new paths through the awakening earth. Clara stood at her kitchen window, watching Lucy and Rose toddle around the fenced yard Jake had constructed, their unsteady steps growing more confident with each passing day. At 15 months old, the twins had transformed from helpless infants into curious explorers who filled their home with laughter and chaos in equal measure. The past year of marriage had brought changes Clara never could have imagined during those desperate first days at the boarding house. Jake's steady presence had allowed her to flourish in ways that went far beyond mere security, encouraging her natural intelligence and capabilities while providing the emotional support that had been missing from her life for so long. Their partnership had evolved from practical arrangement to genuine love, built on daily acts of kindness and shared responsibility. Clara's position in Willowbrook society had solidified completely, with even former critics now acknowledging her contributions to the community. She had established a small dressmaking business from her home, creating beautiful gowns for special occasions while managing her household duties and caring for the twins. The additional income provided independence that meant everything to a woman who had once faced destitution. But more importantly, the work gave her creative fulfillment that made each day purposeful. "Clara," Jake called from the hallway, his voice carrying the warmth that still made her pulse quicken after months of marriage. "Mrs. Patterson's here to see you about her daughter's wedding dress." Clara smoothed her apron and checked her appearance in the small mirror beside the kitchen door before going to greet her visitor. Mrs. Patterson had become one of her closest friends in Willowbrook, and her daughter Sarah's upcoming wedding represented Clara's most ambitious dressmaking project yet. "Good morning, Mrs. Patterson," Clara said warmly, embracing the older woman who had stood by her during the difficult early days. "How is Sarah feeling about the final fitting today?" Mrs. Patterson's eyes sparkled with maternal pride and excitement. Nervous as a cat, but thrilled beyond words. "She's been dreaming of this dress since you first showed her the design sketches." Clara led her guest into the front parlor, where afternoon sunlight illuminated the ivory silk wedding gown hanging on a dressmaker's form. Months of careful handwork had transformed yards of lustrous fabric into a creation that rivaled anything available in Denver's finest shops. The bodice featured intricate beadwork that caught the light with every movement, while the full skirt would create a dramatic silhouette that would make Sarah feel like a princess on her special day. "Oh my," Mrs. Patterson breathed, approaching the gown with reverent admiration. "Clara, this is even more beautiful than I remembered. Sarah will be absolutely radiant." Clara felt deep satisfaction at the praise, recognizing how far her skills had developed since those uncertain early days of marriage. "I wanted to create something truly special for her. Sarah deserves to feel beautiful on her wedding day." The comment carried deeper meaning that both women understood. Clara's own wedding to Jake had been beautiful in its simplicity and emotional significance, but she had worn her mother's altered gown out of necessity rather than choice. Creating magnificent dresses for other brides allowed her to participate vicariously in the joy she had missed, while her growing reputation as a seamstress provided evidence of abilities that went far beyond domestic duties. "When Sarah told me she wanted you to make her wedding dress, I wondered if you'd have time with the twins and all your other responsibilities," Mrs. Patterson continued, settling into the comfortable chair Clara offered. "But seeing this masterpiece, I realize you've found your true calling." Clara appreciated the recognition, though she knew her greatest calling remained the family she and Jake were building together. "I enjoy the work immensely, and having projects like this makes me feel useful beyond household duties. Jake has been wonderfully supportive of my dressmaking business." The mention of Jake brought a knowing smile to Mrs. Patterson's face. "That man adores you, Clara. Anyone with eyes can see how happy you've made him. He was getting so serious and solitary before you arrived, like he was forgetting how to enjoy life." Clara felt warmth spread through her chest at the observation. Jake's transformation had been as dramatic as her own, though his changes were more subtle and personal. The reserved Marshal, who had first defended her against Robert Sterling's persecution, had revealed depths of humor, tenderness, and passion that continued to surprise and delight her. "We've been good for each other," Clara replied simply, understanding that some blessings were too precious for elaborate explanation. The sound of children's laughter from the yard drew both women's attention to the window, where Lucy and Rose were engaged in their favorite game of chasing butterflies with more. enthusiasm than success. Jake sat on the porch steps, watching their antics with obvious enjoyment, ready to intervene if their adventures led to trouble, but content to let them explore their world safely. "Those little girls worship him," Mrs. Patterson observed fondly. "They follow him around like devoted puppies whenever he's home." Clara nodded with deep contentment. Jake's relationship with her daughters had become one of the greatest gifts of their marriage. He treated Lucy and Rose as completely his own children, never making distinctions between biological and chosen parenthood. The twins responded to his gentle authority and playful attention with absolute trust, calling him Papa with innocent certainty that made Clara's heart overflow with gratitude. "He's a wonderful father," Clara said quietly. "Better than I dared hope when I first considered his proposal." Mrs. Patterson studied Clara with maternal intuition that seemed to perceive more than surface observations. "Speaking of children, my dear, you're positively glowing today. Should I be expecting another addition to the Harrison family soon?" Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks at the perceptive question, though she couldn't suppress the smile that accompanied her embarrassment. "It's still very early," she admitted, placing her hand protectively over her still flat stomach. "I haven't even told Jake yet." Mrs. Patterson clapped her hands together with delight that made her look years younger. "Oh, Clara, how wonderful. When is the baby expected?" "Late autumn, I believe," Clara replied, allowing herself to voice the hope she had been carrying secretly for weeks. "Though I'm slightly nervous about telling Jake. We haven't discussed expanding our family beyond the twins." "Nonsense," Mrs. Patterson declared firmly. "That man would be overjoyed to have a child with you. I've seen how he looks at other couples with newborns, like he's remembering what he missed with his first marriage." The observation struck Clara as profoundly true. Jake's first wife had died before they could have children together, leaving him to face years of loneliness before Clara and the twins brought family life into his carefully ordered world. A baby that was biologically theirs would represent healing and new beginnings in ways that went beyond practical considerations. "You're probably right," Clara acknowledged. "I suppose I'm just nervous about change when things have been so wonderfully stable." Mrs. Patterson reached across the space between their chairs to pat Clara's hand reassuringly. "Change can be frightening, but it can also be blessing. Look how dramatically your life has improved since you arrived in Willowbrook. Sometimes the changes we fear most bring the greatest joy." Before Clara could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the front window. Jake was rising from the porch steps with the alert posture that indicated official business, while the twins abandoned their butterfly hunting to peer through the fence rails at the visitors. Two men on horseback were approaching the house, their dusty clothes and travel-stained appearance suggesting they had ridden considerable distance. Clara recognized the lead rider as Deputy Marshal Thompson from the territorial capital, whose presence in Willowbrook usually indicated serious official matters requiring Jake's attention. "I should let you speak with them privately," Mrs. Patterson said tactfully, beginning to gather her belongings. "We can finish discussing Sarah's dress later." "Please don't leave on my account," Clara protested, though she shared Mrs. Patterson's instinct that the visitors brought news that might affect their peaceful afternoon. Through the window, they watched Jake approach the visitors with professional courtesy, his body language indicating attention rather than alarm. The conversation appeared serious but not urgent, suggesting official communication rather than immediate crisis. After several minutes of discussion, Deputy Thompson handed Jake what appeared to be an official document before remounting his horse. Both men touched their hat brims politely toward the house before riding away toward town, leaving Jake studying the papers with thoughtful concentration. Clara excused herself to join Jake on the front porch, curiosity overcoming her, desire to maintain appropriate social distance from his professional responsibilities. "Everything all right?" she asked, settling beside him on the porch swing, while keeping one eye on the twins' continued exploration. Jake looked up from the document with an expression that mixed surprise with something that might have been satisfaction. "More than all right," he replied, folding the papers carefully. "I've been offered a position as Chief Marshal for the entire territorial district." Clara felt her heart skip with excitement and pride at the recognition of Jake's capabilities, though practical concerns immediately followed her initial reaction. What would that mean for us? For our life here in Willowbrook? It would mean considerably more responsibility and travel, Jake admitted honestly. Overseeing law enforcement for 6 counties instead of just our local area. The position comes with substantial increase in salary and eventual pension benefits, but it would require relocating to the territorial capital. Clara processed this information while watching Lucy attempt to climb the fence rails with determined persistence. Change had brought blessings before, as Mrs. Patterson had noted, but this potential change involved leaving the community where she had finally found acceptance and security. When would they need an answer? Clara asked, proud that her voice remained steady despite her inner turmoil. 2 weeks, Jake replied. His blue eyes studying her face with the careful attention she had learned meant he was gauging her true feelings rather than accepting surface responses. But Clara, I want you to know that this decision is ours to make together. I won't accept any position that doesn't serve our family's best interests. The assurance warmed Clara's heart, reinforcing once again Jake's commitment to their partnership. It's a tremendous honor, she said carefully. Recognition of your abilities and integrity. It is, Jake agreed. But honors mean nothing if they cost more than they're worth. We've built a good life here, and you've established yourself professionally. Those aren't small considerations. Clara appreciated his willingness to weigh her concerns equally, with career advancement, though she also recognized the significance of the opportunity being offered. Tell me more about what the position would involve. Jake explained the responsibilities and requirements, while Clara listened with growing understanding of both the challenges and possibilities the promotion represented. Chief Marshal would place Jake among the territory's most influential law enforcement officials, with authority to shape policies affecting thousands of residents across a vast area. You'd be helping establish law and order for an entire region, Clara observed thoughtfully, protecting families like ours across 6 counties instead of just one town. That's one way to look at it, Jake acknowledged. Though it would also mean weeks away from home, investigating crimes and coordinating with local marshals. The twins had abandoned their fence-climbing attempts in favor of collecting interesting rocks, their childish chatter providing cheerful background to the serious adult conversation taking place above their heads. Clara watched their innocent play while considering how this decision might affect their futures. "What does your heart tell you about the opportunity?" Clara asked finally, recognizing that Jake's feelings mattered as much as practical considerations. Jake was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from the twins to Clara's face with obvious love and gratitude. "My heart tells me that I've been given more happiness than I ever expected to find. Whatever we decide about this position, that won't change." The words stirred deep emotion in Clara, reminding her once again why she had fallen in love with this thoughtful, devoted man. "But you're avoiding my question," she said gently. "Does the position appeal to you professionally?" Jake smiled at her perceptiveness. "Yes," he admitted, "it does. The chance to influence territorial law enforcement, policy, to help establish systems that will serve communities for decades to come. It would be the capstone of my career." Clara nodded, recognizing the hunger for meaningful work that she understood from her own experience with dressmaking. Some opportunities came once in a lifetime, and dismissing them required careful consideration of long-term consequences. "I think we should seriously consider accepting," she said quietly, surprising herself with the words. "This kind of recognition doesn't come to many men, and you've earned it through years of dedicated service." Jake's expression showed both gratitude and concern. "Clara, are you certain? Leaving Willowbrook would mean starting over professionally. Your dressmaking business, the friends you've made, the community acceptance you've worked so hard to achieve." "Would also mean new opportunities," Clara countered, though she felt a pang at the thought of leaving Eleanor and the other women who had become like family. A larger city would have more potential customers for custom dressmaking, and perhaps I could establish a more formal business rather than working from home. The possibility hadn't occurred to Jake, and Clara saw new interest spark in his eyes as he considered her perspective. "You'd be willing to take that risk?" Clara reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers while she gathered courage to share the news that would affect their decision-making process. "Jake, there's something I need to tell you, something that might influence how we think about this opportunity." His attention focused completely on her, and Clara felt the familiar flutter of nervousness that accompanied important revelations. "I'm expecting another baby," she said simply. "Our baby." Jake's face went through a series of expressions too, rapid to catalogue individually, ending in pure joy that made him look years younger. "Clara," he breathed, lifting their joined hands to press her knuckles against his lips. "Are you certain?" "As certain as I can be this early," Clara replied, smiling at his obvious delight. "I wanted to be sure before sharing the news." Jake pulled her closer on the porch swing, his arm around her shoulders, as though he needed physical contact to fully believe her announcement. "When?" "Autumn, I believe. October or November." Jake was quiet for several moments, clearly processing the implications of impending parenthood for their major life decision. Finally, he spoke with characteristic thoughtfulness. "This changes things," he said softly. "Having our baby in a new city, without the support system you've built here, without Eleanor and Martha Wells and the other women who've become your friends." Clara had considered the same concerns, but she had also recognized possibilities that balanced the challenges. "It also means our child would grow up in a place where advancement opportunities might be greater, where your position as Chief Marshal could open doors that would remain closed in a small frontier town." "You've thought about this seriously," Jake observed with admiration. "I've been thinking about our future since the moment I realized I was carrying your child," Clara admitted. "This baby represents hope and new beginnings in ways that go beyond location or career considerations." Jake's hand moved to rest gently over her stomach, his touch reverent despite the lack of visible changes yet. "Our baby," he said wonderingly. "After all these years of believing I'd never have children." The emotion in his voice confirmed Clara's instinct that this pregnancy would heal wounds in Jake's heart that had never fully closed. His joy in the twins had been genuine, but having a biological child would complete his transformation from solitary widower to devoted family. "Man, so we'll consider the Marshal position seriously?" Clara asked, wanting to be certain they were making this decision together. "We'll consider it," Jake agreed, "though I reserve the right to decline if I think the position would be harmful to you or the children." Clara smiled at his protective instincts, recognizing them as evidence of love rather than controlling behavior. "And I reserve the right to remind you that opportunities like this are rare and valuable." Their conversation was interrupted by Rosie's determined attempt to climb the porch steps, her chubby legs working industriously, while Lucy cheered her sister's efforts from ground level. Jake immediately moved to assist the ambitious toddler, swinging her up into his arms while she squealed with delight. "Papa!" Rose declared triumphantly, as though conquering the porch steps represented major achievement worthy of celebration. "That's right, sweetheart. Jake replied, settling her on his lap, while Clara lifted Lucy to join them on the swing. "You're getting so big and strong." Clara watched this domestic scene with deep contentment, recognizing that their decision about the Marshal position would be based on what served their family best, rather than individual ambition or fear of change. Whatever they chose, they would face the future together with love and mutual support as their foundation. The following 2 weeks passed in careful consideration and extensive discussion of the Chief Marshal opportunity. Clara wrote to several dressmakers in the territorial capital, inquiring about business possibilities and competition, while Jake researched housing options and educational opportunities for the children. Eleanor provided characteristically practical advice, encouraging them to pursue advancement while promising to maintain their friendship regardless of distance. When Deputy Thompson returned for Jake's answer, Clara felt calm certainty about their decision. They had weighed all considerations carefully, discussed every aspect of the change thoroughly, and reached unanimous agreement about their family's best path forward. "We accept the position," Jake told the deputy formally, though his expression carried satisfaction rather than mere duty. "When do they need me to begin?" 6 weeks, Deputy Thompson replied, handing Jake additional paperwork regarding salary, housing allowances, and relocation assistance. "Chief Marshal Davis wants to spend time briefing you on current territorial issues before he retires." As the deputy departed with confirmation of Jake's acceptance, Clara felt excitement override. Her anxiety about leaving Willowbrook. Adventure and opportunity lay ahead, along with the challenges that accompanied significant life changes. "Any second thoughts?" Jake asked as they watched the deputy ride toward town. Clara considered the question honestly, acknowledging her nervousness while recognizing her underlying confidence in their decision. "Concerns, certainly, but no regrets. This feels like the right choice for our family." Jake pulled her close, his hand resting protectively over the slight curve that had begun to show their growing child. "Whatever challenges we face, we'll meet them together." The promise carried them through the busy weeks of preparation that followed. Clara's friends organized farewell gatherings that celebrated her contributions to their community while expressing confidence in her future success. Eleanor insisted on helping pack their belongings, offering motherly advice about managing households during major transitions. On their final Sunday in Willowbrook, Reverend Morrison delivered a sermon about journeys and destinations that seemed crafted specifically for their circumstances. The congregation sang hymns with unusual enthusiasm, and several families approached afterward to express gratitude for Jake's service and best wishes for their family's future. As they loaded their belongings into the wagon for the journey to their new life, Clara felt profound gratitude for the experiences that had shaped her into the woman she had become. The desperate mail-order bride who had arrived in Willowbrook 18 months earlier bore little resemblance to the confident wife and mother preparing to embrace new challenges and opportunities. "Ready?" Jake asked, helping her onto the wagon seat while the twins played contentedly in their specially constructed travel box. Clara looked back at the boarding house where Eleanor waved from the front porch, at the church where she and Jake had been married, at the community that had given her the chance to rebuild her life with dignity and purpose. Then she turned toward the road ahead, where their future waited with promise and possibility. "I'm ready," Clara replied with absolute certainty. "For whatever comes next, I'm ready." As their wagon rolled away from Willowbrook toward the territorial capital and Jake's new position, Clara rested her hand over their growing child and felt profound peace about the journey ahead. Love had taught her to trust again. Partnership had shown her strength she never knew she possessed, and faith had revealed that the heart's capacity for joy could exceed all expectations. The mail-order bride, who had once feared she would never dance again, was moving toward music only she and Jake could hear, surrounded by the family they had created together and carried forward by hopes that had survived every test. Whatever challenges awaited them in their new life, Clara knew they would face them with the same courage and commitment that had brought them safely through trials that once seemed insurmountable. In Jake's steady presence beside her and their children's trusting dependence, Clara had found not just security, but the profound satisfaction of a life lived with purpose and love. The future stretched ahead with infinite possibility, and she was eager to discover what new blessings awaited the family that had been forged in adversity and strengthened by shared dreams. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.